welcome everybody to this roundtable that is entitled The Future of Cities, Challenges and Opportunities. It's an event of the BSc Summer Forum that is sponsored by IENA. And over the next 1 hour, you guys are going to hear a lot about cities. Why do we economists care about cities? Well, we care about cities because cities are the engines of growth in modern economies. They are hubs of trade, innovation, and human capital accumulation. At the same time, however, our cities are facing a series of challenges, such as the high costs of housing, traffic congestion, other costs of density, such as pandemics, crime, as well as a host of environmental issues, many of them accelerated by the threat of climate change. Today, we managed to bring together a group of world-class researchers who work on economic geography, who are going to give us insights into these challenges that cities face, as well as potential ways to address these challenges. Each of our discussants is going to give a 10-minute presentation. This is going to last roughly until 7. After that, we will open up the floor for questions over the last 15 minutes. So that's the plan. Without further ado, I am going to now give the floor to Professor Ferdinand Rauch, our first discussant, who is the chair of labor economics at the Alfred Weber Institute for Economics at the University of Heidelberg. His work is on trade, economic geography, and development. Ferdinand, the floor is yours.
Oh, yes, thank you. Does this work? Yeah. So I only have 10 minutes, and I want to talk about a recent paper of mine that I've published. It will be a bit superficial because I only have 10 minutes, but you can ask more in the questions at the end if you want to go into detail. And to add how important this topic is of cities, and particularly cities in developing countries, I want to start with one number that I find so fascinating that I like to cite it, which is that urbanization in Africa is really happening very, very fast at the moment. There's rapid general population growth in Africa ongoing, and at the same time there's rapid urbanization ongoing. And both these processes together create double pressure on cities in Africa. And there's a projection from the United Nations that the urban population of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is expected to grow by 1 billion by 2050, so within the next 30 years. That means 1 billion, you know, if you think that Greater London is around 10 million people, that's 100 Greater Londons that we will see new in Africa if this United Nations projection is correct. So this is a very, very important topic, and a topic where economists can hopefully contribute to guide these urbanization processes through analysis, study, research, and advice. And in the context of this rapid urbanization in Africa, I want to talk about my research project, which was about policy evaluation. And the one message I have for the young graduate students or young researchers here who might be looking for research ideas is that policy evaluation is a great thing to do if you just want to do some practical research. What do I mean by that? There are many organizations out there that engage in big development projects. The World Bank, the IMF, European Union, national governments, NGOs, many others. So they conduct really big, well-funded development projects all over the world. And many of these projects are never properly evaluated, meaning that so they throw lots of millions of dollars at some problem here and there, and then they do write summary reports, but these summary reports are usually not the final say on evaluating these things. They're almost always short run, so they're written when the project is finished, meaning when the money runs out. They usually stay within the project, so they write about what problems they encountered in spending the money, what was more expensive than anticipated, what was less expensive than anticipated, and whether the sort of superficial goals immediately were fulfilled or not. But they usually don't do a broad, big economic analysis of the long-run benefits. They don't use alternative data sources, they don't look at the medium run or long run, and they don't consider models usually in these reports. So if you look for research ideas, you could do a lot worse than going to World Bank, IMF, looking for these big real-life interventions and just see decades later what happened and what lasted. And that's exactly what we did here. So we found out about this Sites and Services project by the World Bank, one of the biggest projects they ever did. What the World Bank tried to do was they went into cities in Africa and also Asia, but in our paper we focus on Tanzania. They looked for poor neighborhoods, slums, and tried to make them better by throwing money at it, building new roads, water supply, canalization, schools, street lights, and so on, and trying to make these neighborhoods richer. At the same time, the World Bank also constructed completely new neighborhoods from scratch on the greenfield. And we looked at these gigantic policies. We saw that they had not been properly evaluated, and we thought we could learn a lot from looking at this in terms of policy evaluation. And so we flew to Washington, D.C. We looked into the boxes of these policies, and we looked at the documentation. And one thing we found was neat treatment maps like this one, where you see Tabora, which is a city in Tanzania. The star shows the central business district, so the city center. And you see a few areas where the World Bank upgraded, meaning they threw money at it to make it better, and green areas where the World Bank just built new neighborhoods on the green field. And what looks very nice about these maps, we have tons of them, there were like tons of them, this is just an example. What looks really nice is these are very regular shapes. So you can see how one administrator just sat down with a map and drew like a regular box over it without minding the local conditions. So our identification strategy was also immediately clear when we saw that, right? We could look at the boundary like that and say, you know, let's look at the houses right to the left of the border, to the right of the border, and compare. It's like a, you know, it's clear that somebody just drew a line straight through this without bothering whether the houses to the left or right of the line looked different or not. And so this is the main message I wanted to say to especially young researchers today. If you do this, you find a big policy, you look for the documentation. It's not easy. I mean, you have to go to maybe the World Bank and find these boxes in some basement, and they're full of random documents, most of which are useless, but eventually maybe you hit gold and you find something like this where you see immediately that you could do something useful. The other thing is we combined this with modern day daylight satellite images like this one. So where you can see, so these are two examples of these neighborhoods. One, de novo greenfield top left, one upgrading bottom right. So upgrading again, meaning the World Bank threw money at an existing poor neighborhood. De novo means they built an entirely new neighborhood on the greenfield. Here they are parted by this river in the middle. So this is an example how you could use modern new data sources to study such an old question. The policies we study are from the 70s and 80s. These maps are from a few years ago, and so they help us to see the long-run effects of these policies. And here are examples on this slide, what you could see on such a satellite image, say whether how big are the buildings, is this a good roof material, a bad one, easy access to road, is it chaotic, is it well-aligned, and so on. So many things you can see. So that's what we use in this paper to measure whether these neighborhoods look any better or worse than those that were not treated in the neighborhood. I think I'm getting towards the end of my 10 minutes, so let me quickly say what we find. What we find in this paper is that these upgrading things did not really work well at all. So there's barely any difference to neighboring neighborhoods that were not treated, whereas these de novo neighborhoods look a lot better than other neighborhoods in the city. And that's the other good news if you do policy evaluation of this sort. Whatever you find is kind of interesting, you know. Saying this money was wasted is useful, and saying this money was useful is also useful. So whatever you find is kind of interesting. The last slide I have is just the references. So the first one is the paper I was talking about briefly here. Second one is a paper that does the same thing in Indonesia, but I wanted to get into that, but I don't think I have time, so I'll just leave the reference up there. Ask me at the end if you want. And with that, I hand back to David.
Thank you so much, Ferdinand. Our next roundtable discussant is Gabriel Kreindler, who is an assistant professor at the economics department of Harvard University. He is a development economist studying urban and transportation issues. Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. It's very nice to be here. Thanks a lot. And thank you for the clicker, but I need apologize that I don't have slides, so I'll ask you to step in with your imagination to fill in the insightful maps and cool maps. I want to talk to you for 10 minutes about urban mobility in developing countries. And I think this is really important as mobility, transportation is the glue that holds together what effectively is density in these cities. And it's also very timely now because, as Ferdinand mentioned, cities in low and middle income countries are growing, transforming massively. And this also applies to the way that mobility happens in these places. Sometimes this is not as visible, but it's happening. So just to put some numbers on it, the stock of private vehicles in India, and in many similar countries as well, has been growing at 10% per year over the past decades, and it's not slowing down. This is simply massive. And this is also not a homothetic growth of just more mobility and more transport, but keeping it similar. Rather, there are shifts as well. So Jakarta, which is one place where we have good data over time, we see that the share of public buses has gone down from over 50% to less than 10% in the greater Jakarta area between 2002 and 2018. So these changes are momentous. At the same time, governments are investing a lot in infrastructure, both for road networks and highways, but especially and also for transit. So I want to focus in on two topics in the time I have left. One is about managing externalities. So negative congestion externalities is what I'm going to focus on and what we know about it. And the second one is a little bit of, in a way, of a teaser of where and what kind of infrastructure should be built and what we know about this. So let me go to the first one. So negative externalities are really intrinsic in transportation systems. So I'm going to focus on speed and congestion. So the story is very simple. I drive, I slow down everybody else ever so slightly. I don't take that cost into account, so there's an inefficiency. The question is really how large is that inefficiency? And there's, you can write down models where it's really large, and we want to know what happens in reality. So one paper I want to talk about is a project I did several years ago in Bangalore in India, where I focused on the peak hour traffic equilibrium. And the idea is that congestion is highest at the peak hour, so it may be that that's also a site of particularly high inefficiency, and that having people drive at different times would be much better. How do we understand it? How do we measure it? Well, it's going to be measuring something about demand and measuring something about supply. So on the demand side, I ran an experiment where we want to understand how people substitute to different departure times when they face monetary charges. On the supply side, I measured the relationship between traffic density, so how many cars there are on the road, and travel times. So basically describing the externality. And the punchline from that paper is that it turns out the inefficiency, the deadweight loss of traffic congestion in the peak hour equilibrium by shuffling people around to different departure times is very small. It's around 2 to 3% of all the travel costs, time and scheduling costs that people face. So how can that be? There are 2 points, and one of them is kind of even more general. The first one is that on the demand side, people, as revealed by the responses to in the experiment, are very inflexible in terms of when they want to travel. So people want to travel at idiosyncratic times of the day, but around that, they're not very flexible. And mind you, these were short-term results from an experiment. On the externality side, it turns out that, at least in Bangalore, in the urban road network of Bangalore, as you increase road traffic density, of course travel times go up, but there's no point on this curve that is extremely steep. Even at the peak hour, this is kind of a linear and relatively moderate relationship, okay, which accumulates such that peak hours are really slow, around up to twice as slow as other times of the day, but still this externality is moderate. If you put them together, it means you might convince someone to leave not at 9:30 but at 9. But what you're doing on the externality side then is the difference between how much they're affecting everybody else at these 2 times. And it turns out that all of that together is kind of small. In that paper I also do, you might think, well, what if you convince people to stop driving altogether? And there, this externality that's kind of linear within cities also makes it that the deadweight loss is relatively limited, so 5–6%. Okay. There's other work, for example, Protoy Akbar and Gilles Duranton have a paper in Bogota doing a related exercise, and they reach a similar conclusion. The deadweight loss of traffic congestion is relatively limited. And let me mention a different type of paper that indirectly makes a similar point. This is also Protoy Akbar, Victor Couture, Gilles Duranton, and Adam Storygard. They have a descriptive paper, a beautiful descriptive paper of speeds and travel times in around 150 cities in India. They collect millions of Google Maps trip instances, and basically that's the basis for describing travel times and congestion. And they show two main things. One is that when cities differ in how fast they are, it's not about congestion, but it's mostly about how fast they are at night. And so that, the illusion is, in a way, or it's very likely that that has something to do with infrastructure or with other investments. The second point they show is that congestion is relatively concentrated, and especially it's an issue in large cities and in the centers of large cities, as you might expect. But especially their first point also means that there's a lot beyond just congestion that affects mobility. So let me move on to the second point, which is a few ideas about where to put urban transportation infrastructure, whether it's about roads or about public transit. And here, the flip side of what I just said, which is that deadweight loss of congestion might be small, is that it matters very much where these investments go. With a large inefficiency, you would think that any return from investment is attenuated by this inefficiency, but let's assume for the moment that's not the case. So what kind of investment should there be, and where should it be placed, and how should we think about that? I want to make 3 points. The first is that this is empirically a very difficult question, of course, because there are spillovers from transportation infrastructure investments, and so some papers take the, in a way, very ambitious approach to look at cities as the unit of observation, and we learn a lot from that. So Gendron Carrier and co-authors look at the impact of subway openings on air pollution, and they show that when a city that is high pollution initially opens a subway system, the air pollution level goes down by around 4%, and that's stable they can document up to 4 years. And they can do this exercise because they measure all of the subway openings in the world and pollution everywhere from satellites. There's a different paper by Gu and co-authors looking only at subway expansions in China, which is a large part of all the subway expansions in the world, documenting one of the steps in this causal chain that subway expansions decrease traffic congestion. So we're starting to learn something about this entire process. A second approach, and my second point, is that a different line of work does something else, which is to put more structure on spillovers and to use quantitative urban models to understand, both to give a kind of a framework for how to measure the empirical effects of infrastructure, but also at the end of the day to understand their full general equilibrium effects. And this is great. This has been very insightful. I want to mention 2 papers, one by Clare and co-authors, and another by Nick Tsivanidis, which look in Dar es Salaam and Bogota, respectively, to understand how these projects affect inequality and have the unequal effects on different groups in the city based on many parameters. The last point builds essentially on this final point, on the second point, which is, where do we go from here, and what is open? I think using these types of models even more proactively, so to understand and to have discussions with policymakers of the impact of policy proposals and even proposed policies, is a very, maybe, I think, interesting, potentially tricky direction as well. And I say this not because I have full faith in these models, the assumptions they make, and the parameters that are estimated, but I think that even this interaction between researchers and policymakers, putting these machineries to work, could be very insightful. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Our next discussant is Clare Balboni, who is, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, 3M Career Development Assistant Professor of Environmental Economics at MIT. She works on environmental economics and development economics. Claire, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, David, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the discussion here today. So I'm going to sort of start with the way that David motivated this. So of course, as is well known, cities offer these tremendous opportunity to benefit from the gains from density, but as he also alluded to, are also sort of particularly exposed to these so-called demons of density. And my focus, perhaps not coming as a surprise given the fields that David introduced me with, is going to be on a particular manifestation of these, which is climate risks, which are a sort of prominent form of these risks and increasing rapidly in the context of a changing climate. So there are many, many types of numbers like this one can come up with, but to put some of them here, it's estimated that around about a third of the world's population is currently in cities that are at risk of some form of natural disaster. Really enormous shares, so sort of 90% of urban populations estimated to breathe air that breaches World Health Organization standards, and we know that these risks, the vulnerability to these risks is changing both as climate hazards themselves worsen and as a result of for instance, secular trends in urbanization. And so addressing these risks is really going to require thinking about adaptive urban development in the sense of factoring in vulnerability to climate risks in the urban development process. So my focus, the focus of my research, the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be on the manifestation of these risks, in particular in developing country cities, where it is sort of documented across a wide range of categories of environmental hazards, that climate risks are especially pronounced. But set against that, historically, these have been settings in which it's been particularly challenging to study this. So there's sort of significant data challenges constraining our ability to study these harms, these environmental harms, in those contexts where we believe that they are most acutely felt. So I'm going to sort of put up a few maps to illustrate this, but if we think of one prominent type of environmental harm, this has come up a few times already, is air pollution. An estimated 49 of the 50 most polluted cities in the world are in Bangladesh, China, India, and Pakistan. But if one wants to use sort of historically available data sources to study this, it's not difficult to find a series of maps that look like this. This very nice data sources, OpenAQ, which provides sort of public source air quality information. And one will see that the sort of strongest concentration of monitoring systems for these types of outcomes are concentrated in those areas of the world that do not, by and large, sort of focus on those countries where we see where we believe the risks are most acutely felt. This is not idiosyncratic in that respect. If I look at another type of environmental harm, which is projected increases in temperature, India, for instance, accounts for an estimated, upwards of half of the world's increase in urban heat exposure. Again, if we look at the global historical climate network monitor stations, you'll see these are concentrated, perhaps unsurprisingly, in some of the same sorts of locations, and relatively speaking, reasonably sparse in those areas. Natural disasters, another. I'll stop here. I could go on, of course, but natural disasters, somewhere in the region of 70% of natural disaster events, 90% of natural disaster deaths over sort of recent decades, afflicting developing countries. If we look at where the really sort of state-of-the-art climate disaster sort of catastrophe risk modeling is happening, that's again very strongly focused on types of hazards in developed country settings. So this is the sort of starting point that this is we know to be already and increasingly so a very important set of risks in thinking about urban development, but has historically been difficult to study in those contexts where we think that they are felt most acutely. But on a slightly more positive note, there have, of course, been really enormously rapid advances in the types of data that we can use to study this, both thinking about the types of historical data sets of the nature that I've mentioned, but sort of applied more broadly, but also really exciting new forms of data collection to inform analysis and policy work in this area. So this is an extremely non-exhaustive list of the types of data sets that are being brought to bear on this set of questions. So data derived from satellites, Gabriel's already mentioned some examples of this, GPS data, administrative data, data from mobile phones, data from social media usage, and so on. There are many really nice, exciting new projects sort of demonstrating the opportunities for progress on these sorts of questions using data sets like this. I'm going to focus on two applications that I work on because they're what I know most about, but I'll sort of refer to a few others after that. And in particular, a series of data sets that we have been, continue to work to collect in particularly climate vulnerable cities in Pakistan in two sort of categories of these environmental harms. The first is adaptation, so we're looking at firm responses to major flood shocks. This is based on work which is with Johannes Berman-Mazar Wasim. And the second is thinking about transport infrastructure investment, sort of complements Gabriel, thank you first, that was not planned, for setting this up so nicely for me. Transport infrastructure investments and local particulate pollution. This is based on very sort of new early stage work with the same co-authors as well as Aaron Berman. So on the first of these, excuse me, again, one can come up with many sorts of numbers like this, but the sort of strong focus of many types of environmental risk concentrated in Asia. Pakistan's two most populous cities find themselves in the top 15. Pakistan very, very vulnerable to many types of extreme weather disasters, and we know that that trajectory is worsening in the context of a changing climate. Of particular sort of relevance for our study, these often involve severe disruption to firms and to infrastructure. Last year's devastating floods providing one example of that. So around about a third of the damages estimated to derive from damages to non-residential structures and infrastructure, and that we see across the sort of major flood events in recent history. So the 2010 floods damaged 10% of the road network, for instance. But of course, analysis of how costly and how costly these changes are going to be as we think about a worsening trajectory of disaster risk, and in particular trying to think about using research like that to inform what the appropriate policy responses might be, is going to depend on how economic agents respond to those changes. We're going to focus on firm responses, and this is something that is difficult to study without very granular information on firms and their networks. The reason for that being that both exposure to natural disaster events and the ways that firms might respond, so the adaptive responses that they might undertake, can involve very complex network decisions. So it's not just a question of my premises being affected and choices I make over the location of my premises. It might also be the case that the exposure of firms with which I'm connected in supply chains, or indeed the routes that connect me to those firms, might also be relevant, both in terms of the risks I face, but also in terms of the actions that I can take to try to ameliorate those risks. So the focus of this project is to try to understand how firms weather and how firms adapt following these sort of major types of natural disasters by changing their production and their network linkage decisions. So these are the types of data sets I referred to, that sort of recent data advances are opening up opportunities to lean on to studies questions like this. We're going to use very detailed data on firm locations, but of particular importance, given the setup I've just given you, to the nature of the problem. Information on linkages, so transactions between firms coming from tax records. So this is administrative data that reveals which firms are trading with each other, and we can geocode that based on firm locations. We've then also interested in disruptions to routes that connect firms, which is revealed by an additional data set on GPS trackers from trucks. So here we see very, very high frequency information on the location of trucks that are used to transport goods between firms. And we have a much better sense of both the climate risk exposure, I should say, and vulnerability from data derived from satellites. So we've got detailed high-resolution data on flood events that affect these firms and these roads from satellites, as well as flood hazard models that give us their vulnerability. And if we put that all together, you can develop a series of maps like this that show you that these risks are sort of concentrated in so the firms are going to be concentrated in Pakistan's cities and the kind of major industrialized regions as we'd expect. But we see that the areas, the right-hand map is showing you the expected flood depth in a 1 in 100, under a 1 in 100 year flood, and those overlap very strongly with the location of firm activity and, as well as transport routes. So I'm gonna, in the interest of a 10-minute presentation, skip over essentially all of what the paper does, but let me just give you a sort of sense of what data sets like this yield in terms of our key findings. We're gonna find that these floods cause short-lived but economically meaningful disruption to firms and transportation. And we're going to find that these network effects are really important. And this is something that in the absence of this very granular detail on firms, their locations and their connections would be very difficult to uncover. So we see, a quarter of firms themselves are flooded, but actually, 3/4 of them are going to see one of their suppliers flooded, and half of supplier pairs are going to see the route that connects them being flooded. So this is sort of pointing to the importance of access to these types of data. And we're going to see in response to that, we see a very sort of sophisticated series of responses by firms in terms of their own location, as well as their choice of suppliers, both the number of suppliers, but also the flood risk profile of their suppliers, and their choice of routes, so the nature of their suppliers, not only in terms of how flood prone those suppliers themselves are, but also how flood prone are the routes that connect them to those suppliers. So bringing this together, I'm conscious of time, so let me sort of skip ahead a bit, but the sort of high-level point I want to make in relation to this project is that really thinking about how climate change is going to be important in affecting urban development, this research suggests is going to need to account for the fact that those impacts will be mediated in important ways as economic agents learn from these disasters. The second, just very briefly, project that I want to touch upon, which again I think highlights the sort of potential for new data sources coming online in the area of environmental hazards to think about traditionally hard to study, particularly hard to study in developing country context settings questions, is to try and build on some of the data sets I've described in combination with others, which I'll mention, to think about these questions of the externalities derived from transportation. Gabriel mentioned one form of these. The focus that we're going to have here is on local particulate pollution arising from transportation. This has been covered already and is familiar, I'm sure, to many of you, but a sort of large, extremely interesting literature studying in many contexts the benefits from improved transportation infrastructure deriving from, for instance, trade costs, commuting cost gains. Alongside that, we see in the environmental literature sort of sharply increasing volume of research and sort of huge increases in our understanding, but also sort of sharply worsening estimates of the expected costs of local particulate pollution. So these are a couple of estimates from Pakistan where these really enormous numbers. So sort of estimates in the range of sort of 4 years of life expectancy from air pollution costs, and a very large share of those estimated to derive from transportation emissions. So it is possible that alongside the many other types of externalities one can think about with respect to transport, that these sort of negative local, and I should emphasize that part of the reason this is particularly difficult to study without extremely fine-grained data is that these are, in the case of local particulate pollution, very, very local externalities, both as a result of changing where the traffic is, but also as a result of the fact that transportation infrastructure investments change the distribution of economic activity, which is also often polluting. So here our focus is on how accounting for these local pollution effects might impact our estimates of both the aggregate, but in particular the distributional gains associated with road investments in particular. So I've described the GPS data, and I'm probably about out of time, so let me sort of stop here, but here we're going to supplement this with additional geocoded data, both on the location of road construction and improvement projects, but also a very, very sort of exciting new series of pollutant concentration and transport models that allow for sort of very fine estimation of local pollutant concentrations, which we use to think about estimating policy counterfactuals that can tell us something about how transportation improvements through the lens of the types of structural models that have been described can influence the reallocation not only of vehicles across roads and sourcing decisions across trading partners, but of firms across space, and use this to think about estimating the net impacts of road improvement projects, accounting both for the trade cost gains and for the pollution externalities associated with that. So I want to end on a sort of positive note, which is to say that, of course, there are these sort of very rapid changes both in urban development and in the development of and our understanding of environmental damages associated with some aspects of that. There is sort of really exciting new forms of near real-time, often dynamic measurement. So some of these, the airnow.gov is air pollution monitors at US embassies, global flood monitor data coming from Twitter activities. There are many, many types of these. This gives you a sense of the sort of breadth of data sources here. Finally, that these are used, not, aside from revolutionizing our ability to study these in sort of academic analysis, also increasingly used to aid policy enforcement in interesting and insightful ways that the economics literature is also starting to think about. So this is an example, for instance, where we are studying emissions monitoring systems in China, where this paper is looking at how public participation via social media can influence regulator treatment of violations and so on. A very interesting sort of set of questions around policy enforcement that can also be studied using these types of data sets. Great, thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Claire. All right, our last discussant is Elisabet Viladecans-Marsal, who is Professor and City of Barcelona Chair of Urban Economics at the University of Barcelona. Her work is in the fields of urban economics, economic geography, and public economics. Elisabet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this type of roundtables are an excellent initiative. When Giacomo invited me here, and I was thinking what I can talk about, and when I saw future of cities, challenges and opportunities, I thought this is about climate change. We know that cities face plenty of problems, housing affordability, segregation, but this is the thing that we need to work with for the next years, because if not, we could be really in trouble. So I will try to give you an overview of how cities are important when you talk about climate change. What can we do to fix it if we can? And this last thing, it's about will it be possible if people don't help politicians to apply these policies that are for sure what we need? So I will talk basically about developed countries, and in the end, because I'm the local, you'll see a bit of Barcelona, because Barcelona has recently been what we could be the best lab where you could test and learn about how things are going on in terms of local policies trying to change the cities. So, cities, as we know, home now half of the population in the world, and in 25 years will be 2/3 of the world living here, because everybody wants to be in cities. It's fantastic to be in cities, we know that. They have plenty of advantages, but as Claire and as the others said, cities are very vulnerable to climate change risks. So they are the ones that will suffer the most. Most of the cities in the world are located in the seaside, so they are exposed to floods, heat waves, as Claire was saying. Her geomarket paper is a fantastic paper explaining us how complicated it is. Dávid and co-authors also do the same. The important things are happening close to the seaside, and this is the part that could be in risk. And if these things are happening, these cities could suffer a lot. And urban life could be complicated, and this could have costly consequences. But on the other side, cities are also the ones that are causing this climate change. So this is not that they are suffering it, they are also causing these problems, because they are the best emitters of pollution in the world. So they have to benefit of policies that solve the problem, but they also need to change what they do. What cities can do to solve the problem and to be ready to deal with all what is coming? Usually, national governments are not the best to take advantage of the situation. They don't agree, there is complicated. So these cities are the ones that need to take the advantage of that. Which type of policies? Basically two things. Or they deal with the causes of climate change, try to change their behavior and try to do things to behave better, citizens and politicians and so on. This is what we call adaptation policies. We can do better land use policies. You can, especially in the US, plan more compact multifamily housing, do the zoning in a more effective way. Of course, I will talk more, and here is you see, this is the topic, mobility policies. What about traffic, which is where we have the biggest problem? Then we have the mitigation policies. When the drama is coming, when we have the flood, when we have the drama in front of us, then we need to solve the problem. But in this case, when the drama is there, then cities, they have not the power to deal with this. So they have to play the role in the adaptation policies for sure. So, I will focus on policies related to traffic and pollution. First of all, pollution has been always the problem for cities. So there is a beautiful paper by Stefan Heblich, published in Journal of Political Economy, recent. The title is East Side Story. It's about pollution in UK cities in the Industrial Revolution, trying to understand, depending on the chimneys and the smoke, how population is located in one side of the city or the other. So cities have been dealing forever to solve pollution. We have some traditional policies. We think that, okay, now we are creative. No. 30 years ago, 50 years ago, cities were doing things to tackle pollution, like alternative day travel in Buenos Aires in the mid-70s, trying to solve the problem. No evidence of effectiveness, by the way. Congestion tolls in Singapore, 1975, they induced traffic and possibly displacement, so this policy was not good enough. Low emission zones, this is kind of more modern thing, it's more a European thing. They seem to improve air quality, they seem to reduce traffic, but they have a clear displacement effect, and they can change people's behavior in terms of shopping behavior, so we don't know exactly if they work or not. All this, what I'm saying, there is evidence, there is no evidence, so we need people analyzing these policies and telling us if they work or not. Until here, they seem to be not perfect at all, because the idea is clear, and you'll see in the case of Barcelona, when you decide one of these policies, probably you solve a problem, but you create many other problems. And you need to take into account this other side of the story, because if not, we could be in trouble. But now we have these new green urban policies. This is new wave of policies that try to reduce traffic, so the same as we used to do in the past, also pollution, because this is our homework now, but this new wave of policies, especially in European cities, they try to have less cars, clearly less cars in cities, because they want to give back the space to the residents and to increase the quality of life. This is new. In the past, we didn't care about this. Now we try to have cities that are more friendly with the residents, so we talk about pedestrianization, big lanes. 50-minute city, we don't have time to debate, but it's kind of something that we can talk about. Super blocks. We are in Barcelona. This is what we call tactical urbanism. So this is the new wave of things to tackle climate change, but trying to make cities more livable. So very recent evidence, because this is new and there's not a lot of clear of what this new wave of policies are telling us. So there is a lot of people working to try to understand if these policies are good or bad, and for what they say. There is this Urban Economic Association conference where we used to go. In the last editions, there was plenty of papers, more than ever, trying to understand what we have to do and the impact of these policies. As Claire was saying, now we have new data, so there's no excuse of doing good analysis here. New econometric and better estimation, so for the new students here, there's no excuse to do a good job, because now we can do it. There is also this new, or not that new world, the quantitative dynamic spatial models. Here there's plenty of people, experts, not me, that they are able to give the full picture of the story, not just reduce one. So there is two ways of doing these things. Examples of things that we know people is doing. There is this paper by Bo Sleiman, very recent, trying to understand what happened in Paris when they closed this Voie Georges Pompidou riverbank. And try how the city changed when they decided to this piece of areas close to the river. Now we can walk around. So, and she says, Leah, it's a nice policy, but it's a displacement of traffic and pollution. So there is good for these people here, but for the people a bit far from this beautiful place from Paris. Bike lanes, new thing. We're cycling a lot nowadays, no? We have plenty of papers, Paris, New York, even Barcelona. What's going on with these new bike lanes? Are they affecting the city? They decrease traffic and congestion. This is good news, but for sure, they increase housing prices. It's this gentrification process, so these things that maybe we don't want to see, but this is happening, okay? And when we see Barcelona, this also could happen. Again, these unintended things. This is the Superilla, this is the super block in Barcelona. I would say the biggest pedestrianization area in Europe nowadays. This is from the City Council website, a step ahead and becoming the street transformation model for the entire city. The goal is to create a healthy, greener, fair and safer public space. So this is the idea of super blocks. We are in the neighborhood where this thing is happening. It's the Eixample where we are now. Here is the before and after. This is the change in some parts of the neighborhood, not all the neighborhood. And this is the thing I want to show you. This is the plan. This is the Eixample, the neighborhood where we are now. See this beautiful grid we have here. The green streets are the ones that are just for walking and enjoying. The other ones are like what we see now the streets. So what I want to see and tell you here is that when we have this type of policies that we have to do it because we want to have a better cities, there is not causal evidence of what these things will be for the city and for the citizens. Traffic, maybe displacement or not, so we have some streets without cars, maybe the cars are going in the next street, we don't know. Housing prices, maybe in the green ones, happy, the prices are going up, the owners, not the renters, but this could be the case. Short term versus long term, we don't know because now these things are going on, so maybe in 5 years this will be okay, for the moment we don't know. And the idea is that there are winners and losers here, and we need to be aware of this. Is there a possible backlash? So when we see, and I will speed a bit because probably I'm taking too much time, when we see these policies that some people is winning and others are losing, politicians are not sure about what they have to do. Maybe they know that the policy works, they are more aware to apply this policy. This is good, so we need more evidence of what they work. But on the other side, because there's some transitional costs here, politicians, sometimes they are not sure about what to do. And this political backlash could happen when the voters, they see that the things maybe are not that beautiful as they are supposed to be, and they vote for not the right politicians. And these politicians that had the idea to do these good policies are kicked out of the city council maybe, or of the ministry, and they cannot do these things. So we need to take into account this possible political backlash, people against these policies, because maybe they want to drive the car, or maybe they don't want to see these tall windmills that maybe are not that nice, okay? So, Barcelona, this is Barcelona. This is attitudes toward green policies. 2 green policies that are now in place in Barcelona. On the left, the idea is that does the city council must finish the tram connection? This is a survey. These are not the elections. There's a lot of variety. Some people say yes, some others say no. Second question on the right, does the city council must increase the super blocks? Not clear. In some cases you say yes, yes for sure. In other cases no. So there is not a clear idea of that these things need to happen. This is votes. For the last a couple of weeks ago, we see that in this circle, it seems to be the Eixample, there is kind of more support to the party that was the one designing the Superilla. But we don't know because this unit of analysis is too big. So maybe in one street, people is super happy. Maybe in the next one, people is not happy. So we need more evidence to understand how people is changing their behavior and if they are happy or not, for them to have the politicians that decide for the good policies to take into account. To conclude, just the things to bring home today. First, cities and climate change is a hot meaning for the young researchers. Editors are happy to see these papers. That's why I'm using the hot word here. Then I thought, maybe it's not unfortunate to say hot here, but it's a hot topic. Important, because all of us, we need more research on that. To understand the future of cities, we need more and better research because we need to understand which policies work, because some of them, they don't work, and also these unintended effects that sometimes we don't want to see. And they are there and they could change things. And finally, my last message would be, there is not enough to know which policies to apply, because these ones are working. We also need the good politicians to apply for these policies, and sometimes maybe this could be not the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elisabet. Excellent. We have about 10 minutes for questions. For those of you who have a question, please raise your hand, and we have a microphone for you, because otherwise it would be hard to hear the question.
I have a question for Gabriel. So I was a little bit surprised about you saying how the negative externality of driving is small. And it seems to me that that's probably the case because you're conceptualizing the externality as primarily increasing the commute time, right? Which is a very car-centric point of view, right? We're ignoring pollution, we're ignoring loss of public space to parking lots, to car infrastructure, we're ignoring safety concerns for pedestrians, cyclists, etc. So do you think this would be, this result would be reversed maybe if you included all those other externalities?
Absolutely a great point, and I don't think I emphasized enough that I was speaking exactly only about the travel time, which as a small, point, it's not only a car-centric concept. Any type of mobility, public transport, anything, you care about travel time and about all the locations and people and so on that you can interact with in the rest of the city. But absolutely, it's entirely possible that the pollution generation or some of the other externalities that you mentioned completely swamp these travel times ones, and that's where we should look for inefficiency. So I'm very excited to see what the study that Claire mentioned will find, but completely agree there.
I have two questions. One is for Ferdinand. You mentioned, I don't know, how do we interpret your results? They seem a bit discouraging in the sense that it seems easier for most urban areas to try to fix what's already there than to build anew, which may not be possible. So I was just wondering how you think about that. And I have another question maybe for all of you, which is, Elisabet mentioned that cities should be kind of prime actors in adopting climate change policies. But climate change per se is an externality. Across countries, it's already hard to internalize the effects. Why would a city want to bear the cost, apart from local pollution, of fighting climate change when really, Barcelona cannot make any difference in the global trend? So why should we pay for it somehow?
Yeah, let me answer the first one. Yes, I agree. It might be a little bit discouraging. It's, by the way, consistent with the paper that I didn't talk about Jakarta. They find the same thing, that an upgrading type policy didn't do very much in the medium or long run, or even negative effects in some of the results. But, I mean, it just shows that it's much easier to build something that works new on a greenfield rather than fix something that's already broken. Maybe expectations are too entrenched that this is what this neighborhood looks like, and if you make it shiny in the short run, it will eventually get back to that. But that's a kind of a good message, meaning that we will have to build all these new cities in Africa, or someone will have to build all these new cities. We should just get it right the first time from the start, rather than letting bad cities develop and then trying to fix them later. Would make a lot of sense to try to do it well now, where these things are forming. Yeah.
Claire, Elisabet, does any one of you want to answer the question about the environment?
I'll have to say something.
No, I mean, I can, okay. This is a good point. I mean, why they have to do it? I mean, it's being in trouble, no? When you do this type of policies, I mean, you have some people that are happy, others not. It's true that maybe cities need some coordination, someone on the top saying that we need to do something, because we need to do something. I mean, it's true, eh? Why? Who's starting? Why am I messing with all of this? But cities are the ones that they are suffering the most, especially the ones on the seaside. So they have to do something. When there are floodings, as Claire is showing us, they cannot stand and waiting. So because the problem is here, it's not like we're not talking about 10 years, it's there. So my feeling is that they cannot stay and wait for the neighbor to do it because the problem is already there. So that's my understanding. So it's difficult to understand who will be the first if no one is pushing them, but the problem is already here. The heat waves are already here, the floodings are already here, so maybe it's the reality what is pushing them, I guess.
I think also your point about the local externalities is an important one, and there's sort of increasingly severe some of the sort of shock numbers I put up, but there's increasing evidence of the severity of those types of impacts, and to the extent that causes are correlated, these things are sometimes addressed via policy. But I think that more broadly, the kind of political economy of regional, global discussions on these topics is obviously sort of very high on the agenda, incredibly difficult and incredibly important, but this is such a focus of policy discussions that it's, surely this is something that the types of policies Elisabet discussed is not, it can't be overlooked in the context of national and regional targets on these things. But I do think considering the local, you sort of said, aside from the local externalities point, but I think that one is an important driver of policy, which does have implications for the wider externalities as well, would be the only additional point I'd make.
I have two questions, both for Professor Viladecans-Marsal. I found deeply interesting the part about the causal impact on rents, and I want to ask, do rent increase on average in all the city, or it just changes the distribution? So maybe the ones near bike lanes go up, the others now suddenly are comparatively less prestigious neighborhood and they go down, so.
You mean the bike lanes, no?
Yeah.
The housing prices, more the sales, not the rents, which is something that it's a bit puzzling, but it's what they found. They increase in the areas close to the new infrastructure, or the bike station, or the bike lane. The other ones, they do not decrease, so it's a win thing, okay? So it's like, because it's more attractive, people want to pay more. It's not that, because this is attractive, especially for bike lanes, What is going on with super blocks, which is cars, that's another thing. That maybe could be a different story, because for the street where there's no cars anymore, for sure housing prices will go up. They are going up right now. The street that is taking all the traffic, I'm not sure. Probably this one is losing. With bike lanes, there is not the case. There is not a substitution effect from what we know.
Hi, I have a comment that touches upon many of the points raised, but eventually more directly to Gabriel, which is the following. Thinking about the future of cities, it's difficult not to think about the changes in the working patterns from telecommuting technologies have changed our way of working, and eventually the need to agglomerate into cities, the pressure that this is putting eventually into cities around metropolitan areas, eventually changing patterns of gentrification around. But following both Claire's and Gabriel's presentation, I was thinking about how this could be a sort of positive side of the story in terms of reducing the pressures into congestion to transportation, reducing increasing in relative terms air quality in these likewise very congested cities. So do you see this as a possibility in the developing world, some sort of bright side of the story from telecommuting in this?
It's a great question. I would point you to Andrew's very interesting work we were discussing just earlier today on telecommuting through the lens of these types of models. It's not something I've seen much on the interaction with the pollution in developing country cities, but I agree with you. Considering those interactions seems like a very interesting and an important angle on the topic. I haven't seen any research on this area.
Yeah, I had exactly the same comment on using these kind of quantitative models. This is already happening on data and what's happening in developing countries in particular. I also don't know. One thing I've seen recently in Jakarta is that public bus usage is still very low compared to historical levels. Whether that's a shift away from public or reflective of a more general, I don't know.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Gentleman in the back.
Thanks. So my question relates a little bit to the previous one. I come from a city which is the third largest city in the world without a subway, which is Bogota. And you see there that half of the trips that people make is to Gabriel, by the way, the question, are not related to work. Is leisure or other things like caring and shopping and stuff like that. But yet you get to see that the infrastructure that is being planned responds to either the economic activity or wants to incentivize the economic activity. So you think planning for leisure and non-productive activities is something that would alleviate congestion, and why is this something that is not very well mentioned in the planning agendas?
This is a great point, and you're absolutely right. Yes, majority of trips are not going to be to work, and they're very valuable. I will almost calling them unproductive is somewhat of a misnomer. So I think that's absolutely right. I will again, if you're being repetitive, put a plug for the types of these quantitative urban models that are starting to incorporate, say, shopping trips and into thinking about the impacts of transportation. I think down the line that should absolutely give us a better picture of the returns to specific projects.
Excellent. Time's up, unfortunately. Thank you so much for our discussants as well as the audience for participating in this roundtable. So I believe that's it. Thank you again.